Hello and welcome to another edition of the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast interview series. Now, this podcast is going to look at how methane emissions can affect the process of energy transition to combat climate change. And of course, methane emissions, we hear it in the headlines. We're going to hear a lot more about perhaps combating methane emissions from a man who knows a lot about it. Bart Wauterickx joins us now, and he's the CEO of a Belgian company called the Sniffers. I'm not going to put it in too much context for you because Bart has quite a lot to say. And let me just start off, Bart. I always, I love the name of your company in terms of how do we find methane? We can't see it. We're not going to be able to touch it. So indeed, we have to, as you might say, we have to sniff it out. Talk to us a little bit about the concept of the Sniffers.
Thank you, Edna, for the introduction. The Sniffers helps oil and gas companies to realize their environmental and sustainability ambitions and to help them to operate pipelines in a safe, compliant and efficient way. Our company started 30 years ago in Belgium, working with the important industry in Rotterdam and Antwerp. And today our company has executed projects in more than 35 different countries around the world. We have different teams in different countries, also in the Middle East. Initially, the Sniffer started identifying leaks with sniffing dogs, but besides sniffing dogs, we have a broad range of measuring devices able to identify emissions and quantify these emissions and provide information to our customers so that they can repair those emissions or at least reduce those emissions. How does it go in practice? A small team of Sniffers technicians goes to the client. They go to the client and they monitor all potential leaking sources or emitting sources. For a small unit, it can be a couple of thousand measurements. For big facilities, it can be up to 100,000 of measurements. Maintenance repair orders are created for each leak, and the measurements are validated and processed in order to make a big report that gives that full transparency to the client about their emission situation. In the early days, we called this LDAR, leak detection and repair, and we were very much focused on the release of VOCs in the atmosphere, and that was causing smog and ozone. And there were a lot of regulations and protocols to control that. Today, we are more and more taking a look at methane, as you already announced in the introduction, Edna.
Now, just talk to me about how serious is methane emissions. When we think about it, we hear a lot about CO2, we hear about, climate change, we hear about all the great work in carbon capture. We hear a lot, more on the carbon side. But talk to us about, just how dangerous and how serious methane emissions are.
Good question, Edna. Indeed, the Paris Climate Agreement talks about avoiding a dangerous climate change by limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And the global warming is caused by the so-called greenhouse gases that trap the heat in the atmosphere. The most important greenhouse gas is, of course, carbon dioxide, and that counts for about, let's say, 80% of the greenhouse gases. Methane is the second most important greenhouse gas and stands for about 10%. And methane is emitted during the production and transportation of coal, natural gas, and oil. And methane is also coming from livestock and other agriculture practices, and for instance, also by the decay of organic waste in municipal solid waste landfills. Now, methane has a lifetime of only 12 years in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide has a lifetime of 300 to 1,000 years, methane only 12 years. But the potential of methane compared to carbon dioxide to absorb heat in the atmosphere is 84 times higher than carbon dioxide in the first 20 years. And that makes methane one of the most damaging greenhouse gases, today responsible for 25% of the global warming. The oil and gas industry, together with the agriculture sector, are the main human-made causes of methane emissions. And it's because methane is so potent and because there are solutions at hand to reduce methane emissions for the oil and gas industry. Therefore, it is important that methane is addressed because it's the most effective way to slow down our current rate of global warming.
Now, of course, the oil and gas industry are often blamed, the hydrocarbon industry often blamed, as the main culprits in this. But as you say, we're looking at agriculture, we're looking at waste and all of that. I mean, how do you work, I suppose, across the board here? I can see, how you need to address this from a hydrocarbon point of view, but how do you deal, with the farmers? How do you deal with the agricultural ministries? How do you deal with people who have demand for food? And this is also, a big issue in the world today.
Indeed, there is there needs to be action on a lot of fronts. A lot of businesses have to change, and it is of course very difficult to change the current habits, and it will require some strong leadership. Now, it's important that we make progress for the oil and gas sector. It is important that we do not only take a look at how we can compensate that emission. It's important that every emission is being reduced as much as possible, because every reduction over there doesn't require any compensation. So it's important to find back all those emissions in the full gas value chain, in the full value chain of the energy suppliers, whether this is onshore, offshore, whether this is well production, gas processing plants, or distribution. In every step of the value chain, emissions can happen, and it's important to identify those emissions and to reduce these. As the Sniffers, we are using a lot of techniques for that. There are the classic top-down approaches with satellites and airplanes that do measurements and drones that do measurements. And we have several partnerships in place and have some own equipment to also do that kind of equipment. And on the other hand, there are the so-called bottom-up measuring techniques. And these are techniques where the Sniffers technician really goes out to a customer and measures every individual source, whether something is leaking, and when it's leaking, to quantify these so that priorities can be set up for maintenance or engineering departments to go out and repair and reduce that emission. So eliminating emissions is an important component. And that, of course, on top of the whole emission energy transition that goes on, moving away from coal, moving away from oil, and at the end also moving away from gas and completely going into renewables. Gas, by the way, will continue to exist because it's also used as feedstock for lots of our chemical industry. So it's not going to be completely eliminated, but every emission needs to be reduced. That's important here.
Now, again, when we look at the technology, you talk about in the beginning, it was the sharp scent from the dogs that did this. It was almost manual focus in terms of detecting emissions. But now, of course, you're employing, a lot of different technology on this, and even as you say, satellites and that. But still, we look at the danger of, leaks in pipelines, in wellheads, and processing plants. All this still remains, a real danger out there. How closely do you work with companies and with the industry to make sure, this is eliminated? Is it one of their top priorities right now?
We see a lot of variation when we take a look at companies all over the world. As an example, lots of the major oil and gas companies are a member of OGCI, and OGCI has a lot of thought leadership, and they set themselves some ambitious targets to reduce methane emissions. That's great leadership. It's a great example for the rest of the industry. However, they, between brackets, only represent 30% of the whole energy production in the world. So it's good to see that leadership, and I hope it's inspiring all the other companies around the world. So yes, we work also with the other companies to educate them, to show them especially that there are solutions. And in a lot of those solutions, it's even a positive investment, meaning that the first surveys, the first improvements that are done are gaining money rather than costing money. So that is an interesting path. It was also identified by the International Energy Agency that 70% of the emissions of methane could be resolved with techniques that do not cost anything, are net zero in terms of money. So that's an interesting concept. Yeah? And it's about sharing those possibilities with all those companies. It's also about regulations that have to be put in place by the different countries in order to mandate certain activities, as not all customers are having that thought leadership, are having that internal drive to go after those emission reductions. Not every company is autonomous in that.
Now, of course, the OGCI, that initiative is very, very important, and I think that it'll increase, and more people will be behind it. That, of course, being the oil and gas climate initiative that many of the oil companies have signed up to. But talk to me about older facilities, or is there who's the, if there is a culprit in this, who would be the worst? Is it the older facilities that perhaps are still in need of an update? And maybe talk to us about the concept of super emitter events. What happens there?
Indeed, satellites, as an example, find once in a while super emitters, and these are leaks in installations that are really releasing a lot of methane. And it's almost like an avalanche that waves all the small efforts of the good companies. So it's a lot of methane that suddenly is in the atmosphere. Satellites detect that. We see this as an indication, as a symptom of a lack of the right maintenance techniques, the right maintenance attention, sometimes also as a lack of leadership in these companies. When such a big leak is happening, normally people see this on their normal parameters, but in several cases it is not even seen. They have to wait for signals from satellites. Is this typical for older installations? Yes and no. It is possible that old installations still are, and with the lack of good maintenance, that there are important maintenance issues and breakage in the installations. But on the other hand, we also see investors that are interested in keeping their investment money limited and do not install the latest techniques. As an example, installing gas-driven valves. There's an intended emission connected to gas-driven valves is an indication of limiting investment money and going for the fast return on the investment.
But how can regulation help in this? I mean, what are the regulatory initiatives around that? Everybody is looking at the Paris Climate Agreement and, looking ahead to a cleaner, greener future, but we still seem to be stuck here in a stop-start situation. And this really isn't helping to solve the problem.
Yes, correct, Edna. It's not only regulation, I'll talk about that in a minute. It's also about the financing community that demands from their companies to have a decent ESG score. What is being done about the emissions? What are the objective and validated figures? Financing funds are requiring good figures before really putting money on the table. Going to the regulations, there are several countries in the world that have already specific methane emission regulations. The biggest breakthrough that I'm expecting is especially the initiative from the European Commission. They've announced a couple of months ago the Green Deal. There was a methane strategy announced in November last year, and we are expecting detailed legislation by the end of this year. And this legislation will require energy, so gas companies, to measure, report, and validate figures, MRV this is called, and that will force the industry to provide much more transparency, and perhaps there will be some penalties or some funding involved in that. It's important to understand and to pick up that it's not only about the domestic players within the European Union, also import of energy will be part of this legislation. So export countries like Russia, through pipelines, Qatar, US, Algeria, Nigeria, and to a lesser extent, Norway. These are all exporting companies to the European Union. They also will be affected by this upcoming legislation. It's not yet clear in which direction CAC, the United Nations organization, together with the European Union. That framework will be used as the base of going to be introduced and will create that extra transparency, create that the credibility that is required for this industry, so that their efforts are taken very serious, that we can see all the improvements year after year that this industry is doing.
Now, talk to me about your own program that's in place. The Sniffers recently, the award that you put in place, the methane accounting program. Tell me a little bit about how that's going to work.
Yes, indeed. In our conversations with the regulators and with clients, we've identified that there was a need for a program with a full focus on measuring methane emissions in the gas value chain and throughout the whole value chain, whether this was upstream, midstream, and downstream, and with a big need to make that transparent and credible. And to answer that need, we've created that methane accounting program that delivers that transparency. The program today is being rolled out by some major players and helps all stakeholders to set priorities and drive those emissions down. The Energy Institute valued this emission accounting program in their 2020 competition in the category environment, and we won this award against other nominations from major oil and gas players. So we are very proud on this, and this award gave us the confidence and the recognition that we are supporting our clients with the right services to help them realize their environmental and sustainability ambitions. So we feel very pleased with that award.
And again, I think all programs like this certainly will help. You know, they'll put a little bit of peer pressure, hopefully, on people as well. Now, many executives and leaders I talk to in the industry, when they're talking about, you know, a cleaner, greener future, which everybody, thankfully, is focused on that, all of the hydrocarbon companies, without a doubt, you know, but I'm hearing about, you know, emission free LNG, emission free gas, all of that. You know, how important is it that they reach this? What's you know, realistically, can they do it? And then what is the downside in the event, you know, they don't do it? Are we looking at you know, are we looking at a tax? Are we looking at any punitive arrangements in situations like this? Do we absolutely now have to, since gas is probably going to be that bridge fuel before we get to renewables, you know, we have to make sure that it is cleaner for our world, basically.
I'm expecting that the upcoming legislation in the European Union to be expected by the end of the year, that will incentivize the good value chains. The value chains that have very good control on their emissions will be incentivized. I'm not sure about how this is going to work, but I am sure that the European individuals, they definitely like to have a greener world, and they will drive the market for value chains with low emissions, and they will probably push out of the market the value chains with a lot of emissions. Just because of the behavior of the European citizens, that is a very strong power to drive the right value chains against the value chains that have a lot of emissions. This is all possible when there is transparency around those value chains, and the legislation in Europe will definitely create that transparency. So the driving force could be the individuals in Europe that can decide to take gas from that producer or that importer or another importer. And secondly, I definitely believe that the European Union will also help this mechanism with some penalization or some incentives, depending whether the gas value chains are very green or not so green. So I believe those two mechanisms will play an important role, and it will go very fast. I'm strong. I believe that is going very fast, that process.
Yes, indeed. I think there really is a recognition that all of the hydrocarbon companies, are on board to head towards that cleaner, greener future. We're hearing that. We're hearing it, resounding support for it right across the board. We're hearing it from investors, and we're hearing it indeed from the energy community as well, because there is no choice at this point. And I think, companies like yourself, the great work that you're doing is certainly helping to make sure that they can enable this. Bart, we have to leave it there. I really want to thank you for adding great value to us here on the Al-Attiyah podcast today. Very, very interesting concepts there in terms of what can be done to reduce methane and indeed to overall make sure that we have a greener, cleaner climate out there, because climate change is the very, very heart of what everybody needs to be doing. So Bart Wauterickx, the CEO of the Sniffers, thank you so much for joining us.